My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the fifth Sunday after the Epiphany for the week of February 8th, 2026, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I'm excited because we had some really good responses actually to last week's question, and especially for me as I kind of lightly touched last week with kind of some of the different things that are just going on in the world. I feel like a lot of these texts are playing and getting us to think about things and reflect on things. And that's kind of where I went with things last week, which was, where in your life do you need to stop and reflect and think about things? And it's interesting how we got a couple different answers this week from people. One being kind of this aspect of through life, and just contemplating where they are within life. What am I doing in different places? How do I interpret the things going on in the world? And how do I sit down and make sure that I'm spending that time to do that? And then we got the other side of that same type of questioning and response of the aspect of we get so busy that it gets so difficult for us to actually sit down and reflect. And we make all these excuses that we're so busy with this or so busy with that, but yet then it makes it hard for us to ever set aside time for us just to sit down and actually spend time with God, much less spend time with ourselves, just being us. And I think both of these different responses that we got get into the same idea of the aspect of we struggle with the idea of truly being with ourselves and reflecting with ourselves and allowing ourselves to be just with ourselves. And in that time, inviting God into that moment, inviting God into that time. These are a lot of moments within our lives where we get super busy, so then we never get to the time where we're just with ourselves to be able to actually get to the moment with God where we're able to take the self-reflection and bring things to God. And I think for me, it's been one of the things that I wrestle with too when people are asking me to pray about this or pray about that. It's like these quick prayers that I just send up. But how often do I actually get to sit and really think about some of these things and absorb some of these things and contemplate some of these different things? And I know for me, when I get that time, and I've gotten some of that time lately, I start really reflecting on the importance of life, the importance of communication, the importance of community, the importance of all these different things and how life is so fleeting, that I think it also exemplifies and brings out the point of how sometimes with us getting so busy, it is actually truly a distraction from us actually being able to fulfill and live out life. I know one of the things my wife talked to me about this last week is if Satan can't get to you, he will keep you busy. And I think that's something that we often, all of us, fall into. If Satan can't get us to sin, he instead keeps us busy. And I think in a lot of these times when we are feeling that way, myself included, no matter how difficult it is, I think it's actually moments that we really need to slow down and reflect. And I think especially within this Epiphany season and especially within the way that the world is, I think that's some of the necessary things that we really need to be doing in order for us to really grow and move forward in the faith. So let's just jump into it this week. The Old Testament text is out of Isaiah chapter 58 verses 1 to 9a, and optionally continuing that through 9b through verse 12. This is this aspect that we kind of continue to hear throughout the text that we have this week on how we as the people of Israel or the people will do different actions, but yet then we don't see God. And we start recognizing in that we sometimes do these out of motion, but not necessarily out of the heart. And in doing that, we then start saying, where's God? Where is it, God? And then we do all these different things, but then we're not truly getting to a place where we're allowing ourselves to reflect and get to that place and recognizing that God has been with us the whole time, that God has continued to provide for us the whole time, that a lot of times it's us that's causing the separation, that we are holding on to things or we are saying that God's got to do it in this specific way, and yet then we miss things because we aren't fully present. We aren't fully there. We are fully constantly putting a divide and pointing the finger instead of recognizing sometimes it's also on us as well. This self-reflection that we kind of talked about a little bit in the question from last week to start the podcast. The psalm this week then is Psalm 112 verses 1 through 9 and optionally verse 10. And this is a psalm of recognizing that when we praise God and when we fully open ourselves up and recognize all the different things that God is doing, that's when we actually are more fulfilled, that we are happier, that we can rejoice more. And we recognize how God is doing things, and we start recognizing how beautiful life truly is. And the things that are trying to separate us, the things that are trying to disown us, to wreck us, as we kind of get in verse 10, really struggle with that. I really enjoy verse 10, and I'd recommend reading it this week. The wicked see it and are angry. They gnash their teeth and melt away. The desire of the wicked comes to nothing. This recognition on when we are recognizing God and we are truly doing that means the wicked melts away. The love that we then have because we're recognizing what God is doing for us, this love that is going on between God and God's people, causes the wickedness to melt away. The epistle text or second reading then is from 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verses 1 to 12 and optionally 13 through 16. And this is this recognizing how the proclamation of who we are in Christ doesn't necessarily just come from look at what Christ did, but it's this recognition on how Christ is working within us and sharing that through what we're doing, and recognizing that this isn't a mystery. This is something that's continual and continuing to show it and continuing to do it. It's not just the stating of something, it's the living out of that something that means something. If we state something and don't actually do it, it doesn't mean anything. It's the whole talk is cheap. Your actions speak louder than words idea here coming in 1 Corinthians. That we don't just speak these words of wisdom, it means that we also have to live them out, no matter how difficult that is. Because in doing that, we are actually being able to show the redemption power of who Christ is, and we're able to show the world what that really looks like. And that is countercultural, and that is something that is hard for the world to fully grasp. And it's so beautiful. The gospel text this week then is out of Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 20. We get some beautiful things this week that kind of bring all this together. We get first, coming out of verse 13, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? We'll talk a little bit about that this week, how that is absolutely hilarious what Christ is pointing out there. But then we get into more familiar texts of you are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. People do not light a lamp and put it under a bushel basket. Rather, they put it on a lampstand and give it light for all the house. This recognition on how we then have to let our light shine. This is something that you expose. This is something that you show. This is not something that you are just talking about or saying that these are the specific ways of doing it. And that we show then, especially coming in verse 19, that God doesn't just meet the expectations on how God is understanding things to be. It's not that God just says, here is the expectation and I go and meet that. God exceeds the expectation consistently. And if that is the example for us, then we have to recognize within that, we have to continue to strive to exceed that expectation as well. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug. But Working Preacher, if you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, different biblical scholars going through these texts, giving you ways of looking at, interpreting, ways to be talking about and thinking about and preaching these texts. I think it's an amazing resource. And if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it because it is an amazing resource to have the archive that they have over there. And so make sure to check out workingpreacher.org. But I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having art, prayers, hymns, their different liturgical colors if that's your faith tradition. Also having daily readings to kind of get you into these texts week after week. Whether you are in front of the pews or in the pews on a Sunday morning, I find this as an amazing resource to help give some direction, ways to be thinking about, contemplating, and considering these texts. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend it. It is an amazing resource to help get you prepared for Sunday, just like going to the gym and working out. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies, along with different ecological ideas and things to be looking at. If you enjoy this podcast that I do on a week-to-week basis, it's taking a half an hour of your time, I know you're going to enjoy these different homilies that are coming out, going through the text similar to how I do, going through those from different ideas, or even just looking at different ways to be thinking about more of an environmental theology to be able to implement within your own faith walk. So if you haven't checked out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication, I would recommend checking that out. There'll be the first link down in the references section in the show notes. This week, Jesus gives us some hard examples. And one of the things that I was talking with my wife this week as I was preparing, and she's like, sometimes I really wish when we had just solid examples where Jesus is talking about certain things, let's just talk about those. And I think my wife is right this week. Let's talk about what makes a salt first and foremost. And let's talk a little bit about light. And then let's take those and be able to understand why this is so significant in bringing out within the text this week. So first, we need to understand what a salt is. Now, a salt is an ionic compound, which is then bringing together positively charged ions, cations, and negatively charged ions, anions, and bringing these together so that there is no electrical charge. These are ionic bonds. It is taking an acid and a base and bringing them together, technically. And that means the one that we're most familiar with is table salt, but that doesn't mean that's the only salt that's out there. There's plenty of other salts. But when we're thinking about this and talking about this and understanding it's just a basic understanding of a acid and a base coming together where there is neutral charge. The idea of Jesus going through and stating that if salt has lost its saltiness, what do you do with it? You are stating that something is off. Because if you have lost this saltiness, you have taken the positive ions and the negative ions and something isn't working because a salt is a neutral and thus it is salty. Jesus then gives us these images of light and lighting the world and being that light and the city on a hill. But again, I think just let's look at this basically. It's very interesting that Jesus uses these examples of light. In a vacuum, light is the fastest thing that we have found in the universe, traveling at 299,793 kilometers per second, which is 186,282 miles per second. By the fundamental laws of physics, there is nothing that can exceed that speed. It's hence why within sci-fi, we're always going to light speed. But it's also essential for life. Everything that we know on this planet is dependent on light. The distance that we are from the sun to be able to provide the light energy that we need and the heat that we need in order for us to survive, that we are in that perfect spot to get that light energy to heat our globe and that we have an atmosphere to be able to help hold it in. But additionally, if we think about it just from the aspect of how plants are able to take that light energy and convert it into oxygen, but also into fuel for itself, thus making life possible here is essential. And we think about then also for our bodies, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, how our bodies need the light to help build our circadian rhythms to make sure that we are as productive as possible and being able to give and support the community around us as best as possible and live up to the people that God has called us into being. And we think about how light has continued to transform our universe multiple times over. Artificial light and how that has transformed society and human society. Being able to extend our hours that we're awake, being able to provide light in the middle of the night so we don't stub our toe or other things of that nature. But even going back to arguably the cavemen and stating that one of the aspects that has set aside humans is our ability to be able to control fire, which is an aspect of light. But then let's even get into the medical field. When you think about it, being able to use X-rays to be able to understand what is going on within our body, being able to then do additional research to understand how UV rays, other types of light, is affecting our world, how other plants are absorbing that to be able to utilize for food. These are huge things for us to be able to understand just how our world interacts. And heck, more and more of us are also becoming dependent on light just to be able to hear this podcast. More and more people are being connected to the internet via fiber. What is fiber? Fiber is using cables that have glass filament so that we are able to send the data in light. So it moves faster and there's less resistance because it is moving as light. We've talked about before where light goes in and it is able to expose things whether we want it to or not. And light in and of itself, like a flame, does not have a shadow. It reveals what is truly there. It doesn't bring anything that then causes a shadow in its purest sense. So what is Jesus truly getting at then here in Matthew? Jesus is calling out how at the time we're having the scribes stating things and the Pharisees then, how do you live that out in your day-to-day life? So the scribes reading it, the Pharisees, and then how do we interpret it in a day-to-day life? And this is what you do to live to the letter of the law. But that's not how God works. God exceeds in an abundance. God says, here is the law, and I continue to exceed it consistently. And that is the example then that we are called to live by. We are called to exceed, not just to meet. And that means in doing that we cannot just go through the motions of how we quote unquote live out the faith. It means that we have to continue to step out and challenge ourselves and reach out and go further than what we necessarily think. Because otherwise we are closer and closer to potentially getting to a place where we are salt that suddenly is not really being held together well because doesn't mean anything. We're just going through the motions. You're salt without taste. You're light that you're hiding. It doesn't mean anything if you aren't showing it, exposing it, living it out. If you don't take that risk, what are you doing? The outwardmost source of love that we will get to here in a matter of a few months, of what we base our whole faith upon, the love of what Christ did for us, was not something that was easily contained in a box. It was something that was an outward expression that people thought was crazy. But yet we now on this side of the cross recognize how radical it was, but how necessary it was for that to happen for us. This is something that isn't just spoken. This is something that is lived out. And that's what we hear in that 1 Corinthians text, where this isn't something that's just proclamation. This isn't something that's just fear. This is something that is lived out and having the Spirit work within us to guide us in that wisdom, to help us walk that out, to help be able to interpret, to help be observant of what is going on around us and not just be consumed with the self. Because if we're consumed purely with ourselves, we have missed the point. And again, this is where the light metaphor is beautiful. The sun does not just come for one of us. It comes for all of us. We are all dependent on the light that the sun provides to the earth. Whether it's a cloudy day or a bright sunny day, we still need that light to help guide our day to day. We need it. And thus, our Christian walk, our Christian light within us on a day-to-day basis needs to be helping guide us and needs to be reflected out for others to see. It's not something that we hide and show only on occasions. Because in that way, it becomes more and more like we are not showing praise and gratitude to God. We are putting conditions on it. We are then going through motions and we are getting to what Isaiah is talking about in chapter 58. The aspect of how it's so much easier for us to quarrel, it's so much easier for us to fight and say, is God really present? Is God doing this? Because we're not outwardly expressing it. We're putting it inside. We're putting conditions on it. We're saying these are the only times where my faith is actually shown and expressed. And thus, it gets very difficult for us to ever get to the place like we were seeing in Psalm 112, where we start recognizing the beauty of what God is and what God is doing, and thus being able for us to be able to call out and notice where God isn't. And get us to a place where the wicked are scared, because we are consistently showing that love. We are consistently being the salt of the earth. We are consistently building and working those bonds to make sure that we are in connection with God and walking in step and staying in that neutral state of a salt. That we are consistently having that light burn for others to be able to see. If we aren't doing that, if we become too comfortable with our own faith, if we become so confident that we're constantly like, I am always in the right, I am always walking out my faith consistently correctly, just like in science, that's a dangerous place to be, because there's always room for improvement. There's always room for questions. There's always room for, are you 100% sure? Because we have talked about how our faith should be somewhat similar to a science experiment in the aspect that any good breakthrough should lead to more questions. And if we are so confident that there is no more questions, we probably have something wrong. In my opinion, I think there's a lot of places right now where a lot of us, and even myself in certain areas, are probably too confident with our own faith, that we don't give enough room for us to question in a healthy way. And when that happens, I think that's where then in that it becomes more of a boastful and prideful thing. And the problem that that leads into is kind of like what we were getting at, what Jesus was hinting at, and even Paul is hinting at, that it becomes a pride thing instead of a connecting with God thing. And then it becomes just actions, it becomes just words, and the power isn't there nearly as much. The power of what we believe and the power of these living texts is that they continue to speak and continue to challenge, no matter how many times we go through them. The goal is to be able to be the light of the world, being something that travels faster than anything else we've ever seen. Nothing that we have ever been able to discover travels as fast as light. That is a high bar for us to meet. And yet, sometimes we get overly confident and think we have already met it. And I would argue we have probably found resistance, and there's probably resistance within ourselves that prevents us from truly living that out as well as we should be. There are things that holds us back from truly being able to show and express that love that God has for us to be able to be reflected out to show others. And I think it gets back into like what we talked about last week, that we don't ever get enough time with ourselves to be able to actually truly recognize that. And if we're constantly being busy, it's really easy for us to become overly confident. And I think that's a dangerous place to be. Because when we become overly confident, it's easy for us to forget to truly praise and be thankful. Because suddenly we think it's owed to us. And we don't recognize what the Creator has done for us. And we don't recognize the abundance of what God has done for us. And thus, we start elevating ourselves instead of acknowledging that we are all God's children. Being the light is difficult. It's not easy. being salt consistently and having a neutral charge takes a lot of work. So the question I have for you this week is, where do you need to put in that work to continue to be the salt and to continue to be the light? Where do you need to put in that work to continue to be the salt and continue to be the light? I know for me, there's been a lot of things that are going on within the world that have been very difficult for me. In trying to figure out how and when do I use my voice correctly? Where do I do that? How do I do that? When do I bite my tongue and listen? When do I allow God to speak through me? How do I do that lovingly? I think these are all questions that I'm wrestling with. To do it right and to do it well and to do it consistently. And I don't know about you, but I feel like that's something that I wrestle with consistently. And doing this podcast, trust me, there's plenty of times that I probably should give it more time. And yet it's like, oh, I got to get this in because I'm so busy, getting back to the question from last week. And I'm glad because I do get this time, and I do feel like this is sacred time that I get with God. When I sit here and talk with you, often in the middle of the night, God and I have these really sacred moments. But I also recognize, man, this would be a lot easier if I spent even more time working on this, spending time with God on this. And I feel like in certain ways it would get easier. But isn't that what we all are longing for within our faith walk? Wouldn't that make shining our light easier and easier? It's something we all strive for. It's something we should be all working toward. And the more time that we actually spend with God doing that, truly opening ourselves up, truly reflecting, truly making sure that we're not just going through motions, truly making sure that we're not just meeting the law, but we're allowing and seeing where God is exceeding and abundant, and that we then are able to give that abundance to others, just as God did to us. This is all difficult work, hard work, but needed work. And I know we can all do it. If we all work together and can all continue to make this a practice, we're never going to be perfect, but we can strive for perfection. And the more we practice and the more we strive for it, the better we're going to get toward that goal. I hope that in some small way, the love that God has for me, the abilities that God has for me, spread way beyond just me in this microphone. I pray that it touches more people way beyond myself in places that I will probably never get to. And that's part of walking out the faith, and that's part of the beauty of this faith, and that is part of praying and recognizing and knowing the abundance of what God is going to do way beyond whatever I'm saying, and be able to take my words and do things with them that I can't understand, and recognize that God's going to use that with all these other people around the world who are going to do similar things. And it's going to be amazing how the world is consumed by this love, of how God continues to use all these people to pour into each other consistently. But we can't get full of ourselves if that's the way that God is calling us into, and if that's the way what we truly believe. We have to be open for love to come in, and we have to be able to reflect love out consistently. Let that love shine for all to see. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.